Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar with a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In this podcast, we interview scholars, thinkers, and writers from different disciplines, inviting them to discuss what interests them about utopias, dystopias, and speculative fiction.
Whether you're a student, scholar, or someone looking for reading recommendations, we hope you enjoy listening along. If you do, please let us know by rating and following the podcast wherever you are listening, leaving us a comment, or dropping us an email on utopiananddystopianfictions@gmail.com. So then, Matt, kicking things off slightly differently this time round, we have got a competition winner to announce.
Absolutely. So thanks to people who put in for it. And the winner is Atticus216. I don't know who that is. This is, I suppose, the dangers of having a competition online. Anonymity. So, yeah, if Atticus216 could reach out to us via utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com with their postal address, I will get a copy of the book sent out to you.
But, hey, congratulations, Atticus216. Was that a Spotify entry or
that was a Spotify comment? Yes.
Yeah.
First
Lovely,
one, in
lovely.
fact.
Fantastic. Well done, Atticus216. Yeah, please do drop us a line, and Matt will send you. Are you going to sign it, Matt?
No, absolutely not. Oh. No one wants that. I'll ruin its resale value by doing that, Liam. Maybe I'll just put a little note in with it.
Yeah, that sounds good. Competition winner announced. Cheers, celebrations. Yay. Matt, who did you speak with this time round?
Well, this time round I was joined by Jess Norledge. Jess is assistant professor in stylistics at Nottingham University and the author of The Language of Dystopia, which was published in 2022 by Palgrave. We had a really wide-ranging discussion about the centrality of issues concerning language in dystopian fiction, ranging from the canonical novels like 1984, Brave New World, Clockwork Orange, Handmaid's Tale, Hunger Games, to a bunch of sort of more recent, particularly feminist dystopias, things like Christina Dalker's Vox, Lenny Zumas's Red Clocks, Agostina Bazterrica's Tender as the Flesh. And then also, in fact, we touched on some more unusual texts, stylistically speaking. I would suggest like the Book of Dave, the Ark, and the Pickle Index, of which I've read none of those three, but they sound really, really interesting as we sort of get to later on. Jess began by talking about why we find dystopias so affecting, why it is, in her view, that they linger long after we've put them down. She puts forward the argument that this is about their use of language, which is multifaceted. That language, she points out, is about power and control. It's often a means through which the society depicted is held together, how hierarchies are maintained, and it's used to subjugate individuals and strip them of their individuality. But language is also the mechanism through which resistance can take place. So dystopias are often about the reclamation of language and of one's voice. From there, the discussion turned to free speech. And I asked Jess if it was always dystopian to want to moderate language use. You can listen to her excellent answer in the middle of the interview. But in the second half, we were kind of exploring things around writing style and techniques, those sort of writing styles and techniques that dominate the genre. For example, the importance of language to world building in dystopian fiction and the different narrative perspectives that tend to operate in the genre. We also discussed canonicity, particularly why it is that certain dystopias seem to continually rear their heads at various points in history. But getting away from those kind of classical dystopias, Jess continued to enlighten me about some fascinating hybrid and multimodal dystopias, which, as I sort of already pointed out, like the Pickle Index, which just sounds really good. They just sound interesting. I've got to kind of check them out. Briefly, we finished by discussing something that is called paratopias, which I hadn't come across this term before. Jess talks a little bit about that. And it's really kind of a subset of texts where the dystopia is very near or kind of the present moment. So it's a subgenre, I think, which also seems increasingly prevalent today. So make of that what you will. Why are we interested in writings about our present moment as dystopian in some way? So I thought that was a fitting way to conclude the interview.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks to both yourself and Jess for a great chat, nice lively chat that hopefully the audience find really interesting. As you and I sort of discussed off camera, off mic, I was sort of peripherally aware of Jess, just because she's at the University of Nottingham, which is where all my degrees bar my PhD were done at. So I was sort of aware that she was at Nottingham and she's doing things in sort of stylistics and litling and cogpo that are sort of around dystopias. And so I'm really sort of pleased to have brought her onto the podcast. Are there any sort of particular strands that you want to talk about quickly before we get the interview rolling?
I mean, I've got a strand that I want to talk about, whether it's quick or not. I don't know, Liam. I don't know. I think one of the things that I really found the interview, fascinating. But one of the things I really wanted to talk more about, but kind of got lost, I suppose, in the middle, was, and I feel bad because obviously Jess doesn't have the chance to respond to this here, but it does come out of our discussion on free speech. So we were talking about the issue of control of speech being central to dystopian fiction, and I was kind of trying to come at it from a different angle, and I was thinking about, well, what would a world where our speech was entirely free actually sort of look like? So in my kind of opinion, or my view of utopian dystopian fiction, is that really it's a genre about trade-offs, right? So Utopia, for instance, continually asks us, what freedoms would you be prepared to give up for a better world? That's the kind of question at the heart of the genre, I think. And this sounds a little bit odd, I think, to me, because we naturally think freedom must be a central plank of utopia, right? That often, it's one of those things, if you're going to say, what are the 5 things utopia must do? Freedom is probably going to be one of those things. But if we assume that a world that is entirely free is also a world essentially of anarchy, then for most people, I think, the anarchists aside, that's a dystopia. So the point about utopia is really that it's social. And so because it's social, we must also pay attention to others. So this is a central, I don't know if it's a paradox, but it's certainly a central conundrum in utopian fiction. How much freedom do we give up, and what sorts of freedoms do we give up to live in a better world? So would a world in which our speech was moderated definitely be dystopian, I suppose, was my point. And Jess at one point in the discussion mentioned Lois Lowry's novel The Giver. I feel like I've probably mentioned the novel before in the podcast.
Yep.
But I don't know how much I've talked about it. Anyway, I absolutely love that novel. I couldn't recommend it more if you're looking for another thing for the TBR list. But it's a kind of, have you read it, Liam?
I actually haven't read it. I've taught extracts from it when I was a school teacher, and I think we watched the movie as well. It's mostly in black and white, isn't it? The movie.
I mean, that would probably be right. I haven't seen the movie, but okay. That makes sense with the story. So you're almost certainly thinking about the right thing. Yeah, it's a kind of Bildungsroman dystopian novel, which is kind of unusual, I think, in some way, from the 1990s. Anyway, it's supposed to be a utopian society, or that's how it's positioned at the beginning, called the community, that has given up a huge amount in order to kind of secure its utopia, right? So it's a society of absolutely rigid control, but unlike the more obvious dystopias like 1984 and the Hunger Games, that control is it is at least depicted as in the for the benefit of society. Whereas, say, for example, in 1984, the Hunger Games, it's all about propping up the control of particular megalomaniacs, right? Who want to control everything. This sort of a form of control that's about giving over freedoms in order to live in a better world, right? And then the question that the novel's kind of asking is, well, how far do you go with that, and when does it start to become dystopian? So yeah, this is what I think makes it kind of a really interesting and ambiguous text, because in that society they've given up difference of all kinds, and that involves also very carefully controlled and modeled language use. But it has these like fantastical elements that you've already kind of mentioned, because they have no recollection of a collective history, and they also can't see colors. So this is what makes me think you're
Yeah.
thinking about the right film. And there's a bunch of sort of other interesting innovations that serve the sort of story. But as it develops, the story tells us that this giving up of kind of control of one's selfhood and one's life is bad. But the initial ambiguity begs the question of where the line is, like how much control is good and where does it go too far. So this was a sort of question that sort of I keep coming back to when I'm thinking about utopias and dystopias. And so to go back to the kind of free speech thing, you know, why do we talk about free speech when really what we're talking about is the ability to criticize those in power and to challenge decision making? Like we give up free speech all the time. This was, I think, the kind of thing I was trying to get at in my question with Jess, is that we voluntarily do this. We don't speak freely. Like I'm always controlling what I say. So it's more that I think the idea of free speech is itself a kind of misnomer, and no one actually wants free speech. Even the people that claim they want free speech don't really want to be harassed, right? So I don't want people to be entirely free to say what they think all the time. And one of the problems with society today is that the social taboo against discriminatory language has been broken. And it's actually led to a society that's much more hateful. And that's not, ironically speaking, a freer society at all, because it's one that operates on fear, right? Now, in fact, it's one that oppresses language still further, since some elements of society become afraid to express themselves because of the potential for backlash. So I don't know. Anyway, I kind of suppose that in a better world, we wouldn't need to legislate to prevent abusive speech. But if, as it seems to me, this is happening, sociality is kind of failing, maybe legislation is the only appropriate response that the state can take. So I don't know. I mean, this is, I suppose I'm just kind of getting my oar in that. I think that I kind of flippantly asked this question to Jess, and I did it in a really kind of trivial way, and sort of, but actually I think it's a really thorny issue.
It's so meaty and knotty and complex, because I think and as you've been describing The Giver, I think it is the text that I'm recalling. But as you're describing that, for me, autonomy is so important. Like choice is so important, and freedom. And I think even if there was a world in which freedoms and autonomy were taken away from me, but for it to be sort of squeaky clean and everything's all nice and lovely, I think I still like it's the fact that it's predicated upon the loss of freedoms or the loss of autonomy really sort of almost like rubs me up the wrong way. You know, I sort of feel opposed to it, because I think to be able to express oneself is, and to have autonomy is so central to like the human experience, right? But the human experience itself is so messy and complex and not perfect and full of contradictions and so on and so forth. And I think where we're getting into like free speech there as well is, you know, I think some of the issues we have around free speech right now is that I think that, especially where we see things on the right, or there's a lot of hate speech and discrimination, and I agree that all of that stuff, like there we have quote unquote a freedom, but that freedom can lead to fear and oppression and sort of violence, and therefore like it's freeing for the people that express themselves, but obviously really controlling and restrictive for the ones on the receiving end of that. But I suppose the issue is maybe that we've moved away from, or free speech has come to mean speech free from consequence, right? Rather than, because I think that's where it's become, really, isn't it? It's you see sort of hateful figures say, well, I can say what I want, it's free speech. It's like, yeah, nothing's stopping you from like a legislative perspective, perhaps, from saying what you want to say. But if you are saying something hateful and harmful and derogatory and dismissive, and other negative words are available, you should be, that there have to be consequences for that. That's sort of my take on it. I can see what you mean in terms of like, well, actually, if we were to like more strongly legislate against, against sort of things that people say, I think people would rail against that of, oh, you're taking away my freedoms or my autonomy or whatever. But I also wonder if that, again, I still struggle with the lack of autonomy there. And also, in a weird way, I wonder if it is this is, there's no way of expressing this well, and it's going to sound maybe it's going to sound really contentious. Almost,
so you can edit it out if it sounds contentious.
yeah, I can. No, I'm just wondering, like, if we were to completely forbid hate speech, or completely forbid saying certain things and expressing certain things, then it just means that horrible people can hide their horribleness, right? Whereas actually, if we have this free speech that is not, it's not legislated, it's not controlled in that sense, then people that are arseholes, and I'm controversial language, but people that are arseholes, they out themselves as such. And I wonder if that is almost better. Like, I'd rather know who is a horrible person, so I don't have to deal with them. That is the consequence, right? The consequence is that I remove them from my from the people that can influence me or have direct influence on me, or people that I socialize with, or whatever. That was not a very snappy or straightforward response to this really meaty topic you're mentioning. I think, obviously, to go back to sort of Jess and the examples that we're looking at in dystopian fiction, I think like things are often much more clearly black and white, and I don't think I don't think anyone that has read 1984 well and properly would argue that what the regime are doing to language is a good thing, for example.
I absolutely was not saying that. I mean, I think I'm kind of getting at this sort of idea that, our perception of freedom anyway, we don't have that freedom that we think we have. Like, it's kind of interesting to hear you talking about the sort of importance to you personally of autonomy, as if you have autonomy, Liam. Like, I guess that's my kind of thing. Like, it's almost like we are conditioned to feel like we are these free beings, and therefore any sort of imposition on us is taking away something that we currently have. It's like, well, I've got this now and you're taking it away from me. But the point is, we're not free in so many different ways. And so that goes back to, I suppose, what I'm getting at, which is about trade-offs. But anyway, that was, I mean...
Oh, wait, just on that, I think, like, because something else that I think you mentioned it with Jess, and something that just I wanted just to quickly, like, I get that, like, there's an argument that if we self-moderate, that is because there are, like, it's the conditions of, like, the lack of freedom in society that we've internalized, right? Like, oh, actually, I can't say X, Y, and Z, or I can't do X. We'll keep with say, because that's language.
Foucauldian stuff.
Yeah. Like, I can't say this because there'll be consequences. Because there'll be ramifications. But all the same, because that is internal, the only person in that moment policing you is yourself. And so you could choose to say, okay, I'm going to abide by that. Or say, actually, you know what, sod it, I'm not going to abide by that. I'm going to say it anyway. And I think it's in the fact that there is that choice for me that matters, even if we might sometimes deny ourselves that choice for fear of consequence. It's still self-made. I think that even if that is a self-made interpretation of a societally constructed thing, it's complex, Matt. Come on, it's complex.
I've sent us spiraling off into an entirely different direction. I've totally derailed us, Liam. You had, I believe, something you wanted to say about or talk about from the interview. So maybe we should get back on track with that.
Yeah, I just thought this is still around sort of language and language and control in society, and it was just a text that wasn't discussed in the the interview, and I think it's so like indicative or representative of the topic of how is language used in dystopian settings or even utopian settings, and how does that control and inform society? There's a novel by an author called Mark Dunn, that's Dunn, called Ella Minnow P. Ella, like the girl's name, minnow, like a small fish, and P, the small green thing. Are you familiar with this at all?
No, I mean, as someone who's got a youngster at the moment doing the alphabet,
Well, okay.
It's sort of ingrained in my brain. Yeah, okay.
So,
funny name.
So LMNOP is it's an epistolary novel, so it's, all letters, and it's set on this island. So again, sort of hark back to Utopia, and on the island they have I can't remember the exact name for it. The sentence, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, contains every letter in the alphabet, sort of thing. And it has that as a plaque because this island is allegedly founded by the alleged person that came out of that sentence or whatever. And so they have this plaque, and one day I think one of the letters falls off the plaque. And so then the governing council or whatever of this island say, well, we can't use that letter anymore. We can't say it. It's this is a sign. It's no longer legal. It's no longer, I don't know, I can't remember the exact inflection, but it's not permissible anymore for whatever reason. And as the novel progresses, or the novella, it's quite short, more and more letters fall off this plaque. And as characters are writing letters to each other, they are they are either really careful with their word choice, to avoid the letters, or I think there might be times where they misspell things on purpose, because I don't know, maybe a K can stand in for a C, for example, or a KS can stand in for an X, as another example. And as it carries on, people who break these rules get punished. I can't remember all three stages, but at one point they can choose to get flogged and beaten for breaking the rules, and the final punishment is exile from the island. And the novel then ends with only the letters L, N, N, O, and P being available, and the protagonist, who is LMNOP, I think, at least from memory, she finds the other shorter example that has all of those letters on it, which I can just pull up quickly. And so the example that she then uses is pack my box with 5 dozen liquor jugs, which is 32 letters compared to the 35 in the original. And suddenly society is restored. All the letters are permissible again because there is a shorter way of doing it compared to the quick brown fox. I just thought that was a really quirky example of it. And maybe again, it's not addressing free speech and whatnot, but it's very interesting about how there's the governmental, it's not quite a government, but sort of the censorship from authority, but also how characters choose to abide by those rules and self-censor versus not. Their speech is still free insofar as they can say what they want, but they're really constrained in how they can say it. It's not quite like 1984 when Newspeak, cripples their ability to think. It's just their ability to articulate, which I thought was really interesting. And if Jess is listening back to now my quite lengthy ramble, it's one that maybe she'll find really interesting from a theoretical, academical sort of perspective, or even just readily. It's fun, it's inventive, it's really playful, and again, that playfulness of language, I really like.
That was exactly what I was going to say there, Liam, which is it sounds like a playful version of something maybe like the memory police, this idea of kind of the gradual erosion of sort of, the ability to express oneself in some capacity. The memory police is largely through objects, and this is through language. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I'll have to look that one up, add it to the menu. Really well. Should we get on with it? I think I rambled loads, so and you've got a bit of rambling in as well there, Liam.
Yeah,
so we both had our goes at it. So
just to say, big thank you once again to Jess. I think just now we've sort of focused on sort of language and language and control, but there's so much more in the interview about that, about language and world building. Paratopia, I was aware of previously because I've read the Sumas interview. Yeah, let's crack on. Yeah.
Jingle, jingle. I'm delighted to have with me today Jess Norledge. Jess, could you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Sure. Hi, thank you for having me. My name's Jess Norledge. I'm assistant professor in stylistics at the University of Nottingham, where I teach mostly on linguistics modules from our first year studying language through to specialist modules in advanced stylistics. I also have an MA module on the language of dystopia, which is particularly relevant to this podcast. My research sits at the sort of boundary line, at the interface between language and literature. So I'm a literary linguist, but my literary specialism is in dystopian fiction, with a particular focus on contemporary dystopia and feminist dystopian fiction.
Brilliant. And we're going to talk a little bit about your book, The Language of Dystopia, later, but that was sort of how we came across you. And you wrote that book, I mean, it was published in 2022, but you presumably, as the wheels of academia and publishing turn extremely slowly, you probably finished that a little bit before. So it was a little bit time ago, but what sort of made you particularly interested in writing that book?
So my focus has been on dystopia for a while. My PhD thesis, as long ago as that was, focused on reading the dystopian short story in particular. So the language of short fiction, the readerly experience of short dystopian fiction. So a lot of my early work was on empirical reader response methods with dystopia. So going out into the world and talking to readers in the wild, as it were, to try and get a sense of the cognitive reception around these kind of narratives. And then post PhD, this broadened out into looking much more at the language of dystopia as a genre, thinking about the evolution and change across primarily sort of Anglo-American dystopian fiction, and how we could use tools from the Stylistics toolkit, lovely metaphor from the wonderful Katie Wales there, to think about how dystopia works in the mind. So I do a lot around the cognitive poetics of emotion. So why dystopian texts feel immersive, why they feel resonant, why are you still afraid of 1984 once you put the book down and you put it away? How does it linger? Because I think dystopian fiction does linger, right? It's a very resonant genre. And for me, that's coming from language primarily. And I think using linguistic tools alongside traditional literary critical approaches is one of the best ways of getting at that sort of holistic experience of reading.
That's really interesting. So that's sort of about perhaps how audiences respond, or how readers rather respond to dystopia. But I suppose I kind of wanted to start by thinking about, I mean, it's evident in many canonical dystopian fictions, language itself sort of plays a key role in the narrative. Particularly, I think the control of language we associate with dystopia. So I just thought I'd ask you why you think that is. What is it about language that has drawn the attention of dystopian authors in particular?
So I think in part this comes down to that familiar adage that language is power, right? So language is often, as you've mentioned, manipulated, restricted, in some way suppressed in dystopian fiction. So it's often held up by a totalitarian regime or some kind of authority as a marker of control. It's one of the primary ways in which a lot of dystopian societies are sort of held in order. In a majority, particularly of canonical texts like 1984, communication plays a vital role in the establishment and the maintenance, importantly, I think, of dystopian hierarchy. And as a result of that, it plays a big part in the subjugation of the individual. So not only is it a tool for that power structure, but on the other side of that coin, it also then becomes a language of resistance. So that is a big part of the rebellion and the revolution, and a lot of dystopian text comes from the reclamation of language. Characters metaphorically and often literally regain their voices in dystopian text. That's a big part of a lot of the plot arcs we see within the genre, where characters sort of challenge the rules and expectations of a characteristically oppressive world through language in some way. So the moment when language is lost or concealed or recovered, I think, are consequently highly emotive and resonant in this genre. They're often sort of definitional moments in the progression of a plot line or in the characterization of a particular protagonist. To the extent that so commonplace, I think, is this relationship and those particular kind of tropes that critics like David Sisk in his Transformations of Language in Dystopia book, he makes the claim that, I don't want to quote him incorrectly, but it's something like, so crucial to the dystopia is language that we're justified in labeling it a structural element. And that's a huge claim, that, you know, that fiction cannot be considered dystopian at all without this key language element. It's so important, so integral to the genre. And I think although that might seem like a big claim, especially given the wealth of dystopian text where language is only playing a minor role, but if you think about it, that language use or its loss is so often identifiable, I think, as the novum in dystopian fiction, that it becomes a key defamiliarizing feature of a fiction that might prompt cognitive estrangement, that signals that recognition of an imagined world as a refraction of our own. So much of that, I think, is happening through language, both in the language of dystopia, in the sense of the language used by the author, but also in the ways in which language as a abstract concept is used or manipulated within the diegesis.
I'm thinking, and apologies already because I'm going massively off on a tangent. As you'll get used to that, Jess. I did pre-warn. I'm known for this. I find it really difficult to interview someone and their responses just sort of maybe go in a particular direction. I was thinking there, one of the interesting things is that there's a difference, or perhaps there isn't, but there's a difference between language and voice.
Mm-hmm.
And that one of the things I think that is being conflated here is language and voice a little bit. I'm thinking about, I don't know if you've read Agostina Bazterrica's really provocative, interesting novel, Tender as the Flesh.
Mm-hmm.
You're nodding, that's good. In that, language plays a really central role because it's used to it illustrates the kind of cognitive dissonance of that society in which people are, for those who haven't read it, and you should read it, essentially, I'm not really spoiling it here, but the society in question, meat has been contaminated, and so instead of just all becoming vegetarian, they've decided to eat and farm humans instead. Of course, why wouldn't you? Seems like a logical thing to do. Anyway, so in order to justify that, they don't call it cannibalism, they don't call it eating human flesh, they call it special meat and these kinds of things. And so there's a lot of stuff about language. But then one of the other aspects of the novel is that in order to farm these humans, they cut out their tongues. Mm-hmm. So it's that idea that voice, it's not just that we have to change or twist the language to adapt to a particular ideology. It's that we absolutely have to make someone voiceless in some way for them to be oppressed. So I suppose I was just kind of interested in as to what that sort of, how much of this is about language and how much of it maybe is also about voice. And
I suppose for me there is an indissoluble link there. So you're absolutely right in that the terms are different and that they are being used differently in certain contexts, but I don't see how we could talk about voice without talking about language. So I would definitely see them as intertwined. But I take your point that there's a difference between perhaps characters in these texts who are unable to speak, who have language taken away completely. So I suppose I'm thinking of an equivalent point being, have you read Christina Delcha's Vox? Where, again, I'll do a similar summary for those of you who haven't read it. So women wear in my head it looks like a Fitbit. I'm
Yeah.
aware that it's probably not, but it seems like some
No,
kind of
I'd
Fitbit
agree.
style device that emits an electric shock if they speak beyond 100 words a day, and then that sort of decreases throughout the text. So similarly, where it's not just particular linguistic items that are being monitored, it's more than just characters perhaps not being able to access certain materials, as you see in some dystopias. It's specifically that loss of a voice, not quite as violently, although I suppose that depends
Mm.
on where your meter is for that between the two. Um, and I think there is that line in language restriction and loss in dystopian fiction that operates on a bit of a cline. So between where language is particularly manipulated or shifted, like in The Giver, where you have to use precise language, i.e., you can't lie, as opposed to dystopian fictions like 1984, where there is an entirely new language created in order to shape thought as well as communication. Through to languages like these, where voice is entirely taken away in a physical form, as well as in any other form of restriction.
Yeah, and I suppose in 1984, the ultimate goal is to eradicate pretty much the language to the point where you can't express yourself anyway, because they're gradually taking away lexical elements so that you can say less kind of stuff, and so that you can think less. Yeah, interesting. So yeah, intimate connection there. But I'll get back on with I'll get back to the questions. So all the preparation that you may have done in advance has already gone out the window because I've
Fine,
just uh,
go freely.
in the first chapter of your book, and apologies, this is a very long question. Which published through Palgrave, already mentioned in 2022, and I'll be indulgent here, and I'm going to quote quite a long section at you. I hope that doesn't seem too awkward. I don't know how people feel about having their work quoted back to them, but anyway, you write this: dystopia as a genre is inherently concerned with language, with the relationship between language and society, language and the individual, and fundamental to both language and thought. Language, after all, threatens the totalitarian, with free speech and critical thinking challenging the absolute control of a given social order. It is the tool of the dystopian maverick, both symbolically and in use, and a marker of autonomy, being foundational to rebellion and anarchism. Language, as a consequence, is typically prescribed and or suppressed in dystopia. Linguistic creativity is stifled, vocabularies are culled, and communication is monitored, restricted, and on occasion criminalized. Now, this kind of got me thinking about this, partly from my kind of utopian angle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always kind of filtering these things through utopia, and the question I kind of had was whether or not control of language is always fundamentally dystopian. So maybe sort of getting away from the text a little bit, or we could talk about the text, but is it wrong? Is it dystopian to control language? I'm thinking about the way in which free speech, for example, has been weaponized
Mm-hmm.
by the right in order to create sort of spaces, particularly online spaces, of course, where abuse has become normalized. We might note, for example, in 1984, that has become the text on the right. It's become kind of canonized as, despite its, socialist sympathies,
Mm-hmm.
despite sympathies that it holds for immigrants. And this is, I think primarily because of the connection that people are making that are reading it on the right between ideas about woke identity politics. I use that word in scare quotes, and Orwell's thought police, right? So I guess a very long-winded way of saying that surely some moderation in speech is not only good, but also kind of happens normally, right? I'm sure that many free speech warriors wouldn't drop the C-bomb in front of a grandparent, right? So surely we moderate our language use all the time, right? We've always done that. We speak in different ways to different audiences. So what's sort of different in a dystopia? Why is it that vision of control is bad when we kind of do control language? I suppose that's my question.
Mm-hmm. I suppose there's several points of difference there, aren't there? So the main one I think is the intention behind the moderation of language, the extent of that moderation, and the context in which that moderation is occurring. So to use your example in the question, a person choosing not to swear around a grandparent, I imagine they're doing that so as to avoid upsetting said grandparent or avoiding uncomfortable family situations. It's a personal choice being made for the benefit of a loved one. So the intention of the speaker there, and the choice, importantly, is a key aspect of that language use. There's nothing actually stopping anyone dropping the C-bomb around a grandparent other than their relationship with that grandparent. Whereas looking towards more serious sort of linguistic interactions, the moderation of linguistic items like slurs, discriminatory language, other forms of taboo language are in place in contemporary society to not cause harm. Like they're in place to ensure we don't dehumanize others, that we're using language in an appropriate way in different contexts. The kind of language which is usually moderated in our base reality, to use that term, is usually language that's hurtful, derogatory, offensive in some way. So these aren't, I mean, correct me, maybe there's one I'm missing, but these aren't the kind of language items that totalitarian governments in dystopian fiction typically zone in on. So fictional dystopian attempts to monitor language or restrict language use are never made in order to empower or protect the individual involved or receiving that communication. So it's usually quite the opposite. Restrictions on language in dystopia are often purposefully discriminatory, particularly against minority groups, as in the examples we just looked at. So in Vox, where women are limited to speaking only 100 words a day, that's not there to protect them or to avoid them using offensive language. It's there to monitor intelligent or challenging points of view. The same in 1984. So the thought police aren't monitoring hate crime. Quite the opposite. The 2 minutes of hate is obligatory, after all. What they're keeping an eye on, what they're trying to prevent, is that intelligent opposition, the ability to question, to challenge those in positions of power, the ability to emote, to communicate ideas, or to express agendas that are opposed to the social mind of a dystopian hierarchy. So to hold, for me at least, to hold 1984 and Newspeak up in defense of hate speak is to entirely miss the point.
I think we should just cut that sort of section out and just play it to a lot of people. I think a lot of people just totally misunderstand the point of the novel. Yeah, that was a really great explanation. I'd like to point out where I was sort of I mean, that sort of question maybe sounded like I was sort of challenging what you're saying, and I that wasn't really what I was trying to do. I suppose I was just trying to get to the sort of interesting nuance of it, and I think you brought that out really well there. So in the book, you also have a chapter on dystopian world building. How did you find, with that research, that language was being used by speculative fiction authors to do that?
So, I mean, obviously, I am biased and somewhat evangelical on this one, in that language to me is at the heart of all literature and literary experience. So, in terms of world building, it's the main driver. So, world building as a process, world building in the mind, is text driven. So, the way that we conceptualize dystopian landscapes, the way we imagine and engage with dystopian character, are wholly dependent on the way that we engage with language. So the particular linguistic items that are being used, manipulated, amplified, primed in your attention are going to determine the way that you focalize on a text, the way that you imagine a dystopian world progressing, the way you respond to it as well. So all forms of cognitive reception, like I mentioned at the beginning, this being a key area of my interest. So immersion, suspense, empathy, fear, they're all going to be driven by particular linguistic nuances in the language of a text. So in the same way as I think there is a very clear relationship between language and voice, going back to your last question, I think there is an indissoluble symbiotic relationship between language and world building. The two are sort of bread and butter in the genre, and I guess in all genres. But for me, obviously the focus here is on how dystopian worlds are created in the mind. And yeah, so looking at language, thinking about both the sort of world building in terms of place, space, but also in the mind, that cognitive aspect is key for me as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, you mentioned sort of language as the novum. I'm thinking about A Clockwork Orange, Anthony Burgess, as kind of the absolute pinnacle of that idea, where the really noticeable thing immediately is that these people speak in basically an entirely different way to us, and that sort of, and you grow into understanding that as you get through the story, and by the end it's a very disarming read in the first 10 pages. What is going on. So there's the sort of language is obviously driving our emotive responses, but it's also in that sense indicating that this is happening at a different point in history, or sort of that there are I suppose is that something that you think is specifically a dystopian technique, or is that just a technique of science fiction? I don't know. Is that just a science fiction thing, or is it a dystopian thing?
I mean, I think constructed languages in particular, so conlangs obviously have a really strong place in science fiction and fantasy, and I think their use in dystopian fiction is hugely important. I mean, if you take Nadsat out of Clockwork Orange, it's just an entirely different novel. And the same with Newspeak. If you look at dystopian languages like Larden, which was Suzette Hayden-Elgin's perception language in native tongue, they're a huge part of how those worlds are working, how the characters function. A lot of them carry the sort of ideological force of those novels as well. I mean, I know that most of Newspeak comes out through the appendices, but it's such a big part of how that world building is working, that I think they're very much a key part of dystopian fiction, the sort of the dystopian languages. I mean, if you've read the Book of Dave, in which case I'd recommend it's quite fun, where it's split between a sort of modern day London setting. You follow a taxi driver called Dave, and his journal is unearthed many, many years into the future, and they then sort of worship Dave and they honor the Book of Dave. And so their language mirrors this sort of Cockney slang of this London cabbie. And the way that changes the presentation of this sort of entirely wonderfully humorous satirical future world is through your recognition of that slang and what they think those words mean in the future, as opposed to what they mean now.
It does sound good. I'm fascinated by it. Are we kind of like predisposed, do you think? Like, as soon as we encounter language that is divergent from ours, are we therefore predisposed to sort of distrust something about it? There's something off. Like, what I mean is, I suppose, rather than it being just a science fiction thing, it's more explicitly a dystopian science fiction thing, because we are in some way put off balance and made uncomfortable by that language. I don't know. That was just I'm very much thinking on the fly here as to why.
It's an immediate point of recognition of difference, isn't it? So when you pick up most dystopian novels, they start in medias res, somewhere in the middle. Stuff's already happened. You're sort of just thrown into it. Clocks are striking 13. You've just got to figure it out. Whereas when you open something like A Clockwork Orange, and immediately you're hit with, or like Ridley Walker, which is wild to read, where the language is so different on the page that you can't pick that up and think, this might be quite a safe read. It might be quite it's wholly pushing you out immediately. From that first page, that something is off about the setting. I think it is a really powerful tool for defamiliarization. Absolutely.
Brilliant. In another chapter, you also talk about, we're sort of on the theme of thinking about, I suppose, writing techniques to some extent. You talk about narrative perspective. It's actually something I've thought a bit about in relation to utopias, which often have this kind of central figure who is a guest in the world and has to be explained. It has to be explained to them. But dystopian fiction works in an entirely different way usually, and I wondered what sort of consistent patterns you found across the sort of set of texts you were looking at in relation to perspective. Is that something that's quite fixed in dystopian fiction, quite similar, or is there quite a lot of variety?
I think there is quite a lot of variety across the genre. I think certain parts of the genre you'll recognize, if not consistent patterns, recurrent patterns. So I'm thinking of a lot of dystopian YA fiction is narrated from an internal first-person narrative perspective. So I'm thinking, let's see, so The Hunger Games, Sunrise on the Reaping, though notably not ballad, because of course we can't ever be given access to the mind of Coriolanus Snow. So that stays in third person with some really wonderful free and direct style to give you glimpses, but never let you in fully. Other first person, they're Divergent, The Darkest Minds, Delirium, Matched, Ali Condi, these all have that first person internal narrative perspective from the sort of didactic center of usually the leading protagonist. That seems to be relatively recurrent in sort of contemporary YA. Across the book, what was perhaps most notable for me in terms of point of view perspective was more the prevalence of what Alan Palmer refers to as the social mind or social thought. So where aspects of thinking aren't instrumental, so of the individual, but are sort of shared by a collective group. So a lot of Dystopia's work in terms of the sort of revolutionary aspect is a way of a character fighting back against that social narrative, that social perspective in the fiction. And that I would say is quite recurrent. Particularly in any dystopia that has a revolutionary, rebellious element, that the narrative perspective in one way or another is going to signal some sort of resistance to the social mind.
Yeah, I kind of think in relation to sort of the YA stuff you talked about, that seems to be dominant at the moment. The very much sort of, I suppose that first person thing is also about kind of promoting this sort of sense of empowerment of the young person, and the sort of stand of individualism against sort of collectivism and all these kinds of things. I'm always I personally more interested in kind of like, I don't know, I like Kafkaesque stuff, and sort of that third person where it's sort of kind of you're kind of in there and you're kind of not in there, and there's some things and there's some things I quite like that, but I think that's just me. But I suppose it does make a real difference, doesn't it? But yeah, there is more variety, isn't there?
Yeah, and readers certainly have a preference. I mean, a lot of people really hate second person fictions where it's addressed to a you all the way through, or perhaps more experimental forms. But I think, for a lot of readers, it's down to things like identification, what they're able to become immersed in. So it might be that a first person voice really positions you within the text and you feel like, yeah, I am Katniss. Whereas
I do not feel like
it might push you out.
Yeah, there's many reasons why I don't feel like Katniss, but mostly it's the fact that I just have no power over my surroundings whatsoever. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that struck me about the book is that you took quite a lot, certainly the early part, about sort of canonical dystopias, but not entirely. And I wondered if that was a strategy, and what drew you to those specific texts. And also because, this was 2022, whether there's anything you kind of read since then that you wish you'd sort of had a chance to talk about in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was really important to me coming into this, with the book having a title like The Language of Dystopia, that it at least had a decent breadth to it in terms of the scope of text I looked at, but that it also looked at key sort of foundational works and perhaps more niche, less well-known titles. So there's a section of the book where I talk about prototypes. So your characteristic go-to novels. If you said, Matt, what are your top 5 dystopian novels? You'd be able to give me a list, and that list would be different from Liam's or from another reader's. And your top 3 might be similar, and then it might start to branch out. And where you see the sort of lines of the dystopian genre will also be really different. So for me, text like The Power, Naomi Abraham's The Power, sit right at my periphery line of dystopia because of that sort of, I don't know if magic is the right word, but the sort of fantastical elements that come through that thread, which move away from the sort of more realist themes at perhaps the center of my dystopia net. So I wanted to try and catch some of that movement and some of that division differences amongst readers. So I looked a lot initially at things like tagging on sites like Goodreads and things like that to get a sense of what people considered to be dystopian and where perhaps, if we can talk about a genre having an edge, that edge might be, and where those lines start to shake a little bit. So yeah, the early chapters definitely start with 1984, Brave New World, The Road, Parable of the Sower, Fahrenheit. They're all up front and center, as I hope you would expect in a text with a title like this. It'd be really weird if you opened this book and there was nothing in it on those novels. I imagine quite a few people would think that I'd maybe gone mad. Whereas what I wanted sort of particularly towards the second half, where the book starts to take on a lot of sort of contemporary themes. So the chapter on dystopian ethics focuses in particular on representations of gender and gender politics in dystopian fiction. So a lot of the texts in that chapter, handmade aside, were really recent at the point of the book being written and then it coming out. So texts like Lino Zumas's Red Clocks, for example, that was 2019, was talking about the reversal of Roe versus Wade. And there was a point where that happened in the summer. The manuscript was being copy edited and I had to write to the publisher and say, I need to put a thing in my introduction that says I was writing this before this happened, and because it completely reframes the analysis in that chapter. So some of them were very recent, very new at the time. And then there are a couple of short stories in there as well, which is lingering from earlier interests. So George Saunders' The Central Girl Diaries from his wonderful collection, 12th of December, which are perhaps completely outside of the periphery. I've yet to find someone that would give me that in their top 5 other than perhaps me. So I wanted that evolution to be apparent in the book, and I think it's certainly not linear. It doesn't follow a chronology, but there is, towards the end, as the chapters start to look at contemporary themes, the evolution of the area, that a lot more of those sort of newer texts do start to come through.
I wonder what canonical is anymore as well, because I mean, I always think of Brave New World because I studied it at school, and I would suggest I recently I've canvassed students on my utopian dystopian fiction course as to how many of them have read Brave New World, and no one ever puts their hand up. So I always think, because I have this rule where I try not to teach I do put 1984 on the module, but I don't put Handmaid's Tale, I don't have Hunger Games. I kind of try and stay away from those because I think, well, if they've already read them, I want to sort of introduce them to something different. But maybe I should put Brave New World on there because they've never ever read it. I don't know if they've read Fahrenheit 451 anymore either. But
it's more like a bit of a revival on
yeah, well, again, it's a sort of Orwellian sort of it's kind of connection to free speech, and isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. I hope you don't mind me quoting you again. This is one of those things where I don't know that I necessarily agreed with this as a statement, but I'm really interested to know what your thoughts are. So at the end of the introduction, you write that, quote, evolution, I contend, defines the dystopian genre, with the form being receptive to socio-cultural feeling and the movements of history. And I wonder if you might say a little bit about what you mean by this, because it strikes me, for instance, that while I can see dystopias respond to their historical anxieties, right, absolutely, most of the dystopias that you're writing about, certainly in that early part, the canonical ones we talked about, are canonical because they don't just seem to do that. They are in many ways timeless. We talked about 1984, Brave New World, Handmaid's Tale, Fahrenheit 451, Hunger Games. So in popular culture, we often see sort of articles along the lines of why Brave New World is more relevant than ever, or or why George Orwell got it exactly right, or whatever. So in another sense, isn't it the case that they're tapping into something, dare I say, timeless? Because that sounds, like sort of they're Shakespearean in some capacity. But yeah, what do you think about that?
I suppose the key point there is that they're timeless because those anxieties have never gone away. So the reason why texts like 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale are still being quoted in this way and are as resonant as they are is because those fears are still everywhere. You know, if we were not living in a society where things were still extremely imbalanced for particular minority groups, texts like The Handmaid's Tale might seem like it was a long ago concern, but they aren't, because the things that are at stake, that are at issue in those world building, imaginary, extrapolated futures are still possible, if not ongoing at the time. So I think if you look at certain older dystopian texts like Ray Bradbury's The Murderer, wonderful short story where he's talking about technology, and he has like a watch that talks to him and sends him all of his messages from his family, and it won't leave him alone, and everything in his house beeps and makes a noise, and he can't get away from all the notifications, and then he can see messages from people all the time and they know where he is and where he's online. That's just today. And actually, when you read The Murderer, it's not scary. It's terrifying in a wholly other sense if you're as reliant on your phone as I am. Whereas I think when you're looking at ones like 1984, The Handmaid's Tale, that have those sort of social factors that are still very present in the contemporary moment, I think that's why they are still of the present, even though they are now quite old. But I think when I'm looking at evolution and hybridity, it is in part, yes, that reflection of the socio-critical, socio-cultural backdrop, sort of cultural zeitgeist at the time of writing. But I think the evolution is also happening in so many other ways, which is why I think it is central, really important to dystopia as a genre, because we see both that hybridity along those peripheral genre lines, so where it's starting to merge with aspects of fantasy fiction, so like The Power or The Darkest Minds, The Young Elite, you know, where there's a sort of shifting focus between dystopian backdrop and fantasy power structures, or things like where dystopia and vampire fiction has started to meet. I've recently read a dystopian retelling of Pride and Prejudice, which is mind-blowing. You know, so there's an evolution there in terms of, if we call that form, and then also in terms of mode. So you asked me in the last question if there was anything I didn't get a chance to write about that I wish that I could. And there was initially plans for a chapter on multimodal dystopian fiction. So works which operate perhaps transmedially across modes. So I've looked a lot at a text by Annabel Smith called The Arc, where it's a digital book, but it also has a sort of web page, and it's about a underground sort of arc, post-apocalyptic scenario, and all of the pages are as if you're rifling through this archive that you've uncovered. And so things look like transcripts from interviews, bits of maps, text messages, encrypted secret messages between people who were in the arc. And then the reader can add to it. So through the website, people put in sort of fan fiction pages to put back into the arc. There's fan art, little videos that have then built this dystopian world out from the text as it was created. So there's an evolution there in form, or something like, you probably can't even get it anymore because technology has moved on so fast, but Eli Horowitz's The Pickle Index, which came out on one of the original iPhones, and you downloaded the app and you got a little bit of the novel every day, came to your phone, it was dated at whatever the date was you were reading it, as if it was a news article, as if it was happening to you in the world around you. But then you sort of had to shake it. This doesn't sound real when I describe it. And it comes up with like a recipe for pickles, because the whole world only eats pickles. And so you get these recipes which you could send to your friends like through real world WhatsApp. And then the secret revolutionary messages were at the bottom of the recipes, and that was the narrative. The characters in that had Twitter account, like there was ways to sort of interact with it in a wholly other way that I think sees the evolution of the genre. So when I say sort of the moment, of the present, yeah, in terms of its political, socio-cultural message, but in how people are then engaging with those messages, I think is something that the genre is really good at in terms of keeping up with that creative impulse.
You start your book with a kind of taxonomy of dystopia, and we've stripped out a question where I was going to ask you to try to define some things. We thought that's kind of a bit boring, but you have in the actual book, you do sort of go through a period you're giving descriptions of anti-utopias, critical utopias, critical dystopias, which I suspect our audience may be familiar with, at least some of these labels anyway. But anyway, I kind of wanted to pick on one that was interesting that jumped out. And later in the book, you describe what's called paratopias, and I wondered if you might tell us a little bit about that, particularly I think as it sort of follows on a little bit from what we were just discussing.
In terms of the evolution, yeah, absolutely. So this term doesn't come from me. So going back to the Red Clocks novel that I mentioned a couple of questions ago, the author during interview, when sort of thinking about dystopia, etc., was sort of asked this question, and she categorized her own work as paratopian. And the interview's fascinating. Go away and have a look at that if you're interested in it. But she says that she was kind of imagining Red Clocks not as a dystopia, but as a paratopia. So she makes the argument in that interview that some think about dystopia feels separate from us. So it's usually ahead of you in the future, so you're looking towards 1984. That's many, many years. Even now, sort of, I know that it's 2050 when it's supposed to be complete or whatever, but it's a long way away. Whereas some think about paratopia, she argues, feels of the moment, so that this could actually be happening maybe next week is her phrasing. So the term itself, if we follow the sort of dystopia etymology pattern, would be something like para as beside, topos and then place, I suppose. So translating something like a place beside, so a world beside our own. So in the way that Zoomas is using it, and the way that I've then attempted to address it linguistically, would be to designate a type of dystopian narrative that presents both a recognizable future reality, as usual, but one which could exist very soon as a sort of soon to be realized place. I mean, I think Margaret Atwood had said in an interview previously that there's nothing in The Handmaid's Tale that wasn't already happening. And I think there's a similar vibe here, that in the Red Clocks novel, it could have happened as I was reading it, and eventually it caught up with the writing process. So she was absolutely right there, unfortunately. And so I think what's interesting about these is the sense that there's a wave, I think, of these dystopian novels coming through, particularly at the time of writing and since then, that operate as a sort of dystopia in progress. So they're often undated, I think, for that purpose, in that you're reading them and like, well, this isn't right now, but it really could be. And there's a sort of uncomfortably close sense of projection there. So I think in a reviews, like professional reviews I've seen of Red Clocks, they reviewers tend to use terms like dystopian realism. There's a sense of dystopian realism. So this sort of believable, authentic representation that this is a future we could progress to, should current events be allowed to continue. So I'm looking at them in terms of that different sort of resonance, in that I think it was Frederick Jameson who said that our base reality is like the past of something yet to come. So in like a lot of dystopias, we're the old world that they're looking back to, like in the Book of Dave, we're the world that had London cabbies that they don't understand, or in Uglies, where the world with the bits of machinery they can still see. Whereas in paratopian fiction, I think we're encouraged to conceptualize base reality as the past of a future yet, not as a past of a future yet, it's yet to come. So one that we're yet to prevent. So it's not that future's far away, it's right on the border of where we are, and that we need to act. And there's a really gorgeous passage in Red Clocks where she's talking about, so they call it the personhood amendment, that's what comes in, that puts all of these restrictions in place, and they build the pink wall. And this was around the time that other walls were being talked about in American politics. And I think reading that, she's like, I could have done more. I sent stuff off, I donated, I signed the petitions, and it still happened. And so I think it's got a call to action in it of, you're living this right now. If you, the reader, don't pick up something, this won't be paratopian, it will be dystopian through that lack of action. And I think they're a whole other kind of terrifying.
And there's a real sort of prevalence of them right now, right? I suppose.
Yeah.
And is that the indicative of our world being close to dystopia? I mean, is that what it's kind of suggesting? I mean, how you define dystopia is this sort of big question, and when would we already define our world as dystopian. I mean, I was thinking about we talked about Ursula K. Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas on this podcast before, but when you read that, you realize, oh wait, we already live in the dystopia. In fact, our world is much worse than the world we're having depicted here, that it's being presented as to us as a dystopia. And our world is much worse than that. Interesting. We're getting to the end of the interview now, but last couple of questions I'd like to ask. Firstly, perhaps to talk a little bit about what you're working on at present, if you don't mind me asking that.
So I'm still sort of in this area. So the Paratopia thing it didn't leave when I finished that last book. I felt like it needed more of my time. And I've just finished working on a project, an article on Paratopia and climate fiction, because one of the questions that I've been asked previously in relation to the book is, you talk about Paratopia, is it always gender? So is it always a feminist dystopian thing? And no, I'm now trying to look beyond that. So I look particularly at dystopian worlds that deal with drought, like representations of drought. So it's on Claire V. Watkins' Gulfame Citrus and Bachir The Water Knife. So that one is sort of just on its way now, with the expansion of Paratopia. But most of my work at the moment is then on gender still. So that the feminist dystopia for me is a big area that I'm continuing to navigate, and that will be what's next after this. So looking a little bit more into contemporary dystopias. Sandra Newman's Julia is the one currently on the agenda, which is a retelling of 1984.
I read Julia only about a month ago. Harrowing. Nice though. I mean, it was like a fresh coat of paint on something. That's what it felt like to me. I thought it captured something about Orwell's novel and style very nicely. But I mean, the stuff that happens near the beginning of that novel, unpleasant.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, that sounds really good. I look forward to reading that. So as a sign-off, we always ask our guests to tell our audience of a text. Could be a novel, film, piece of criticism. Obviously, your own work excluded. Should obviously check out The Language of Dystopia. That is the name, right? Because I have done that wrong before. Is that
yeah,
right?
That is right, yeah.
I've said this at the end of this book, and I've totally given the wrong name that you think, something you think everyone should read.
Okay,
ideally something you'd recommend, perhaps, for the intersection between language and dystopia.
You said I could cheat and do too, so I'm going to. Absolutely. So I think for the intersection between language and dystopia specifically, absolutely go away and read Sisk's Transformations of Language in Dystopia. It's a wonderful book. Read it from cover to cover. Each of the chapters sort of looks at a different dystopian novel that has language at its core. And I would say that particularly if you are in the literary critical sphere, perhaps more than the linguistic sphere, this is going to be a really nice one that sits at that borderline. I think it's incredibly accessible. And certainly was a key read for me in putting my sort of this book and other earlier works in place. For something more stylistic-y though, if you would like to wander over into the dark side of literary linguistics, I'd recommend an article by Deirdre Burton called Through Glass Darkly Through Dark Glasses, which is one of the very earliest sort of feminist stylistic accounts. She doesn't refer to it at that time because it was sort of early 80s, but in it she puts forward, it's such a vehemently, it's wonderful argument that sort of all knowledge is produced within an ideological framework. And she's making the claim that it's the job of the analyst to recognize that relationship between linguistic structures and reality. She's not talking about dystopian fiction, it's on the bell jar. But the argument line she's making, I think, is for me so inherent in the relationship between language and dystopia, that ideological political stance, that commitment of the analyst to sort of influencing improvements in the human rights and the human condition, which is equivalent in dystopia, really comes through. It's an extremely passionate read, sort of putting forward that avowedly political perspective in literary linguistic analysis. It's gorgeous. Read that.
Well, thank you, Jess. And there's a whole bunch of stuff before you said that I'm also going to have to go away and read as well. Now, we often joke that this is just massively inflating our TBR
TBR, yeah.
lists, and there's no way I can keep up with it. So I'm doing, we're doing a podcast episode roughly every month, and I'm getting about 3-4 months worth of materials out of each episode. So I'm drowning in it, but it's great stuff. Thanks so much for joining us, Jess. Been really great to have you on. That was really fascinating.
Thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you to Jess for coming onto the podcast. It was great to chat about how language is used to create dystopian narratives by authors, how language is used by powerful figures to create dystopian scenarios, and how language is also used within fictional worlds to resist dystopian regimes. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by rating and following the podcast, leaving a comment, or sending us an email on utopiananddystopianfictions@gmail.com. And of course, please tune in next time where we will explore more utopian and dystopian fictions.